The finale of Better Call Saul repeatedly returns to the motif of the time machine. As Walt dismissively notes while talking to Saul, time travel as we think of it in our wild, science fiction infused fantasies is not a real scientific possibility. Walt thinks of it as merely a device for thinking about regrets, and he feels quite pompous and above it all in his clear dismissal of Saul's time machine thought experiment. As with a lot of what Walt says, there is truth to it, but it's not the whole truth, and it's a reductive form of the truth. Not everyone who is given a time machine would want to reminisce about their old regrets and the things that they could fix about their own personal lives. That is a line of thinking that is fundamentally far more popular among people who have a lot of regrets in their lives. And this category includes a lot of the characters in Breaking Bad. Perhaps not all of them, but most of them. Walt, Jesse, Skyler, Saul himself, as well as a lot of the characters we were introduced to only in Better Call Saul, such as Kim and the now deceased Howard Hamlin. Mike is the first person to drag the whole time machine idea into a discussion about regrets. Jimmy, in a flashback to when he and Mike were left alone slogging through the desert, asks Mike what he would do if he had a time machine. He expects Mike to pick some fantastical place deep in some far bygone era of history. And instead, Mike transforms the discussion about time machines into one about regrets, because he is burdened by his regrets. Of the characters in the Breaking Bad universe, Mike is the most upfront about the level of regrets in his life. He is more willing to face these regrets. He's more upfront about them. As embittered as Mike can be, he is capable of a remarkable level of honesty and self-awareness that a lot of characters in the Breaking Bad universe do not possess. He at first almost chooses to go back to the time his son was killed to stop that from happening, but he demurs, and instead decides he would go back to the day he took his first bribe, all the way back in the 80s, because he is aware that the date that his son was killed was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a lot of corruption, a lot of immorality that he chose to be a part of for decades and decades. Mike is astute enough to recognize that a lot of the illusions that we have about going back in time and fixing one single detail or one single choice we've made in our lives are fantastical. That single choice is not this little isolated incident. It is the result, perhaps the inevitable result, of a pattern of behavior and of beliefs and feelings and ideals tracing back to old experiences from decades bygone. Believing that one's life could fundamentally be fixed and lifted out of a mire of fragmentation and ennui and existential uncertainty simply by fixing one little detail about the past through time travel is fantastical, not because time travel isn't possible in that kind of way, as Walt implies, but rather because it abstracts these single little incidents from the whole, from the larger past with all its different choices and perspectives and ideals and values. It's easy to think of fixing one little incident. It's much harder to think about fixing the pattern of behavior that led up to that incident, and the ideals, conceptions, perspectives, and values that contributed to the proliferation of that pattern of behavior. If you read War and Peace, which you really should, Tolstoy talks about this issue very directly in the context of grandiose history books. He says that a lot of historians do not understand the behavior of a figure like Napoleon because they isolate him from his environment and believe that every choice he makes should be this astute, thoughtful, abstractly genius choice if Napoleon is in fact a military genius. The historians looking at, say, Napoleon's campaign in Russia from a more abstract point of view point out various choices that would have been more practical and wonder why he did not make them. But this, says Tolstoy, is entirely the wrong way to look at history. And it's quite similar to the way that a lot of fans look at choices that a character makes. They wonder why a character makes what they think is not the logical or the rational choice. And in reality, the flaw is on the part of the observer who abstracts choices from their environment and does not understand that they come out of a series of choices and a series of different factors, psychological, emotional, philosophical, political, that lead to the choice being, in Tolstoy's view, the only choice that could have been made. Tolstoy is a bit of a fatalist, and I would not believe, as he does, that in any given scenario there is only one option for a given political figure of a certain mindset and a certain worldview. I think people always have the freedom to make different choices. But he is correct that in a given scenario, a person would, if you ran the scenario over and over again, tend to make the same choices because these are the choices that come out of who they are and what they have done in the past and all the factors they are considering, some perceptively, some erroneously, and all the different advice they're getting, and their different conceptions of their past and their future and destiny and culture and religion and philosophy and morality. All of these different factors combine to make the choices that people make. So historians trying to just abstract one choice from, say, a military campaign and saying that, oh, if this person made a different choice here, everything would have been different. Perhaps that's true, perhaps it's not, but there's a reason they made that choice, and it's connected to their political perspectives, their ideas about victory and morality, all the different practical factors that limited them from making other choices, and their feelings about the past. If they've made a lot of choices that worked in the past, then obviously they're going to be more likely to make the same kind of choice in the future. And it's also true, as Tolstoy points out, that we like to think in terms of these big choices, that people just have these abstract plans that they draw up and execute them to perfection. But in reality, that's not how circumstances develop. Whatever your big practical plans, in the heat of life, you have a lot of little choices, and the little choices that you make ultimately lead you to somewhere you didn't expect to be. If you ask, say, Napoleon if invading Russia in 1812 would be a good idea back when he was just crowned Emperor of France, he would probably say no and wonder why that would be something that he would do. But the invasion of Russia is the result of a lot of little choices, a lot of decisions on how to respond to broken alliances, or the position of troops that leads to the invasion of Russia being the only reasonable choice for Napoleon. And it's the same thing for someone like Saul. He doesn't choose to become some sort of amoral lawyer for drug dealers. Him arriving at that point is simply the result of a lot of little choices that he made along the way there. And when you adopt this wider perspective, the idea of a single choice that if you went back in a time machine and changed it would change everything is a little silly. Sure, there are choices that would have a material benefit, such as Saul talks about in his discussion to Mike, when Mike reprimands him for being overly money-focused. If you invested in Berkshire Hathaway, back when it was started, you would be richer than you are now. But what does that say about your ability to carve a space for you to escape from all the emotional and psychological negative patterns that are holding you back? Tolstoy uses a chess analog, and I think that's appropriate. If you lose a chess match, you might blame yourself. You might think, oh, I made this one blunder that cost me the match, and if I hadn't made that one decision, I would have won. But you make multiple poor decisions, perhaps, throughout the course of the match, and it just happened to be that one that your opponent happened to take advantage of. There are all these other factors that determine whether we succeed or fail, whether we get to be where we want to be or whether we don't. It does not simply depend on this clear, unambiguous abstraction where there is a beautiful, clear plan and just a few mistakes that if you fix them would make everything orderly again. People would like to live in that world, but that's not the world we live in. Mike understands that the situation that got his son killed is the result of a series of bad decisions that he made a long time ago due to misplaced priorities. Escaping these misplaced priorities is the most fundamental thing to achieving the sort of peace and harmony that the characters we see, regardless of their ambitions, really do want a piece of. But changing these patterns is hard. Walter White proves that during the conversation about the time machine to Saul. Jimmy asks what he would do if he could go back in time, and instead of saying, oh, hey, I shouldn't have built a meth empire, or I shouldn't have made the decisions that got my brother-in-law killed, because remember, this is right after Ozymandias, he goes into this rant about gray matter, saying that he shouldn't have left, giving a delusional and incredibly uncharitable view of what happened between him and Elliot and Gretchen, and then dismissing Saul utterly as a person when Saul offers to give him some help in the gray matter situation. Fixing a single choice would not fix Walt's trajectory, because that trajectory comes from a series of decisions that accumulate over time and that come out of this grandiose, grandiloquent narcissism and solipsism. Saul is not quite like that. There was absolutely a way for Saul's life to not be ruined. There was absolutely a way for him to end up not where he was. Those bad choices add up, but they are not indicative of some fundamental character flaw that is so glaring that it can't be overcome, like in the case of Walt. Even though Jimmy never says specifically what his moment in time to go back to would be, it's shown pretty clearly in the show that it would be to a broken conversation he had with Chuck, where perhaps the two brothers could have sat down and tried to sort out their disagreements. That's at least what Jimmy is hoping. And this is where Jimmy gets the idea for the time machine in the first place, because that's the book he remembers seeing, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Now, whether Jimmy having a longer conversation with Chuck where they actually talked about all their issues with each other, about all their resentments that have been building up for a long time, whether that would have helped is questionable. But it is true that Jimmy is not so far gone that he cannot change for the better. He knows that somewhere there was a way that he could have gotten off the path that led him to where he is now. And he knows that even though he's on this path in such a way that there is no way for him to escape with both his conscience intact and to not have to go to life in prison, he understands that there is still a chance for him to redeem himself, at least in his own eyes and those of Kim. He completely torpedoes the very generous plea bargain that he got, agrees to serve the rest of his life in prison, and accepts responsibility for his actions. His life isn't perfect, but at least it is a life he can be somewhat proud of. It's an honest life. I don't know if Jimmy has read The Time Machine, but I think he would like the ending of it, honestly. In the ending of The Time Machine, contrary to the expectations of the time traveler, there are no grand utopias, no beautiful visions of the future. Human society, after the age of the Eloi and the Morlocks, eventually collapses altogether, and there's nothing left. Not even ruins. There is the twilight of the earth itself. But still, there are these strange little creatures flopping around. Life still exists. It might not be perfect, it might not be beautiful, it might not be what the utopian dreamers of the 19th century thought the future would look like, but it's still life. It still endures. I think Jimmy would appreciate that. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. Keep watching Better Call Saul. Go back and rewatch all those old episodes. It really has been a lovely ride to be with this show for so long. Couldn't have hoped for a better ending. Anyway, tune in soon for the next analysis. It will be coming relatively quickly. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.